The morning Jasper Carver watched a woman climb down from the eastbound stagecoach with a trunk so heavy it took two men and a considerable amount of cursing to haul it into the dust. He told himself she would be gone inside a week. He was leaning against the post outside Haggerty's General Store in Calico Flat, Texas, in the summer of 1879, turning a spent rifle cartridge over and over in his fingers, the way a man does when he is trying to look like he has nothing pressing on his mind, when in truth his mind was the most crowded and uncomfortable place in the entire territory. He had ridden in from his ranch 3 miles east only to pick up a sack of cornmeal and a new pair of work gloves. He had not ridden in to watch women arrive on stagecoaches, and yet there he stood. She stepped down onto the packed earth of Calico Flat's Main Street with the careful deliberateness of a person who has spent 18 hours being thrown around inside a wooden box on wheels and is determined not to let that show. She was wearing a traveling dress the color of storm clouds, and her dark auburn hair had come half out of its pins, which she seemed completely unbothered by. She looked up and down the street with green eyes that catalogued everything they saw the way a surveyor catalogues land systematically, without sentiment, without fear. She was not the kind of beautiful that announced itself and waited for applause. She was the kind that crept up on a man sideways, the kind that settled into his chest before he realized it had taken up residence. Jasper pushed himself off the post and went inside to get his cornmeal. He had made an oath, after all. The oath had been born on a night 2 years prior, when a woman named Clara Simmons had stood in the doorway of the very ranch house Jasper had spent 3 years building with his own hands, and told him she was leaving on the morning coach to San Antonio, and that she was not coming back, and that she was sorry but this land was going to swallow her whole if she stayed one more winter in it. He had asked her to stay. He had said the words out loud, said them twice, and she had looked at him with something that was worse than hatred because it was pity, and she had left anyway. He had stood in the dust watching the stagecoach disappear and made himself a promise, silent and absolute, and as hard as the iron on his fence posts. He would build his life alone. He would run his cattle, work his land, and he would never again put himself in the position of asking a woman to stay in a place she had already decided to leave. It was, he had told his friend and neighbor Walt Briggs on more than one occasion, the only sensible policy for a man in his situation. Walt had told him it was the most pig-headed thing he had ever heard, but Walt was a man who had been happily married for 11 years to the same woman, and had no understanding whatsoever of the particular pain of watching someone walk away from something you had poured your whole self into building. Jasper Carver was 31 years old, 5 days past his birthday, which had passed without celebration as all his recent birthdays had, and he had a ranch that was beginning to turn a real profit, and a dog named Biscuit who was loyal and uncomplicated, and he had decided these things were enough. He got his cornmeal. He forgot the work gloves entirely. Dorothy Bailey had come to Calico Flat because her cousin Margaret had written to her 4 months prior with a proposition. Margaret ran the boarding house on the north end of the main street, a solid 2-story structure called the Calico House, and she needed someone to help manage it. Her husband Earl had broken 2 of the bones in his right hand in a dispute with a fence post, and was going to be largely useless for the foreseeable future. Margaret was a woman of tremendous capability and very little patience for asking for help, but she had recognized a breaking point when she reached it, and Dorothy was the one family member she trusted completely. Dorothy had come from St. Louis, where she had been working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods firm that had recently gone under, taking her savings and her prospects with it. She was 27 years old and had arrived at the conclusion that her life needed to change in a fundamental way, and that change, when it came in the form of Margaret's letter, was best met with decisive action. She had packed 2 trunks. She had sold the rest of her things. She had boarded the train west and then the stagecoach further west and then another stagecoach even further west until she arrived in Calico Flat, Texas, which was smaller than she had imagined, dustier than she had imagined, and hotter than anything she had been able to truly prepare herself for. But the sky was enormous. She had not anticipated how large the sky would be. Margaret met her at the coach with a hug that was brief and fierce and thoroughly Margaret, and the two of them oversaw the relocation of Dorothy's trunks to the boarding house, while Earl hovered usefully nearby with his bandaged hand and his guilty expression. "It is temporary," Margaret said, which was something she said about a great many things that later turned out not to be temporary at all. "Of course," Dorothy agreed, and began unpacking her first trunk that same evening. She had been in Calico Flat for 3 days before she met Jasper Carver properly. The meeting happened at the post office, which shared a building with the telegraph office and the office of Sheriff Holt, who was a large, placid man with a remarkable mustache and a deep philosophical commitment to avoiding conflict wherever possible. Dorothy had gone to inquire about mail forwarding from St. Louis, and Jasper had come to post a letter to his cattle broker in Fort Worth, and they had arrived at the single window simultaneously from opposite sides of the narrow room. "After you," Jasper said, because whatever else could be said about his current state of hermetic self-sufficiency, his mother had raised him with manners. "Thank you," Dorothy said, and stepped up to the window. He noticed, while he was waiting, that she had a ledger tucked under her arm and that she was wearing ink stains on the inside of her right wrist the way people who actually used their hands for work did. He noticed that she stood straight without being stiff. He noticed that she smelled faintly of lavender and more prominently of fresh bread, which meant she had been helping Margaret in the boarding house kitchen that morning. He noticed entirely too many things and stopped himself deliberately. When she stepped back from the window, she looked at him directly. Most people in Calico Flat who had heard about Clara had developed a habit of looking slightly past him, as though he were a landscape feature of the specifically melancholy variety. This woman did not do that. She looked right at him as though he were simply a person standing at a post office window, which was what he was. "You are Jasper Carver," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am," he said. "And you are Dorothy Bailey, Margaret's cousin." "The same." She tucked the ledger more firmly under her arm. "She speaks well of you, says you fixed her roof last spring without being asked." "The shingles were coming off," Jasper said. "It needed doing." Dorothy nodded as though this confirmed something she had already concluded. "I am getting the sense that a number of things in this town get done because someone decided they needed doing, and that someone is often you." Jasper did not have a ready answer for that, which was unusual for him. He was a man of functional conversation, comfortable in silence, comfortable with the direct exchange of necessary information. He was not accustomed to being observed and characterized in the space of 30 seconds by a woman who had been in town for 3 days. "I just try to be useful," he said finally. "A good policy," Dorothy said, and walked out of the post office into the brilliant white heat of the Texas morning. Jasper posted his letter and stood for a moment longer than was necessary beside the window before going back out to his horse. Over the following 2 weeks, Calico Flat being the size that it was, he saw Dorothy Bailey with a regularity that had nothing to do with intention and everything to do with geography. He saw her at the general store, where she purchased supplies for the boarding house with the focused efficiency of a person who has learned to stretch money carefully. He saw her in the evening, sometimes, sitting on the front porch of the Calico house with a book, taking advantage of the cooler air that came down off the plains after sundown. He saw her at the Sunday church service, which he attended out of a combination of genuine faith and social obligation, sitting beside Margaret and singing with complete confidence in a voice that was not trained but was entirely earnest. He did not seek her out. He was firm about this. But when Walt Briggs invited him to the Calico house for dinner one Friday evening, Walt and his wife Nora were regular boarders at Margaret's table on account of it being the best cooking in a 30-mile radius Jasper accepted, because he had always accepted Walt's invitations, and changing that pattern would have required explaining himself, and he did not want to explain himself. Dorothy served the table that evening. Not in a servile way, but in the way a woman who is managing a household manages it, moving around the room with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, keeping conversation flowing and glasses filled and making sure old Mr. Packard at the end of the table, who was deaf in one ear and had been a boarder at the Calico house for going on 6 years, got his portions doubled without making a show of it. Jasper watched her and was annoyed with himself for watching her. After dinner, the group moved to the front parlor where Margaret had a decent piano and Nora Briggs could occasionally be persuaded to play. Walt settled next to Jasper on the straight-back settee with 2 glasses of after-dinner whiskey and said, without preamble, "She is extraordinary, isn't she?" "I don't know what you mean," Jasper said. Walt gave him the look that 11 years of contentment had given him the right to give. "Of course you don't." Across the room, Dorothy was explaining something to Nora with quick, animated hands, and her laugh when Nora said something back was sudden and genuine, nothing performed about it. Jasper drank his whiskey and held his oath like a man holds a fence post in a high wind with both hands and considerable strain. The trouble, the real trouble, began 3 weeks after that dinner. One of the men who regularly boarded at the Calico house was a traveling cattle buyer named Rex Holt, no relation to the sheriff, who came through Calico Flat every 6 weeks or so on his circuit through the territory. He was not a bad man, precisely, but he was the kind of man who had spent too long being competent at his work, and had mistaken that competence for a general superiority over the world and the people in it. He had taken a decided interest in Dorothy. He had expressed this interest in a manner that Dorothy found, as she told Margaret, approximately as welcome as a horsefly on a hot afternoon. She was not frightened of him. Dorothy Bailey had a spine that could have held up a barn, but she was genuinely tired of the way he found reasons to be wherever she was, and the way he had begun referring to her as Miss Dorothy, with a familiarity she had not invited. The matter came to a point one Wednesday morning when Dorothy was crossing the street from the general store with a crate of canned goods, and Rex Holt decided to be helpful by taking the crate from her without asking. She asked for it back. He smiled and kept walking. She stepped directly in front of him. "Mr. Holt," she said, in a voice that carried the particular clarity of someone who is choosing their words with great precision, "I did not ask for your assistance, and I would like my crate returned." Jasper was coming out of Haggerty's across the street. He stopped. Rex Holt had the crate in both arms and was wearing the smile of a man who found this amusing. "Now, Miss Dorothy, I am only trying to—" "I am aware of what you are trying," Dorothy said, "and I am asking you to stop." There was a small crowd forming. Calico Flat was not large enough for any disagreement to go unwitnessed, and Rex Holt's smile became a fraction less certain as he registered the audience. Jasper crossed the street. He did not run. He walked with the measured pace of a man who is not alarmed but has made a decision, and he came to stand beside Dorothy with the easy posture of someone who happens to be passing and has simply paused. "Rex," he said pleasantly. Rex turned. "Carver." "Miss Bailey seems to have things in hand," Jasper said, and his tone was so perfectly mild that it took Rex a full 3 seconds to understand what was being said to him. Rex set the crate down on the boardwalk. He glanced between them with an expression that was calculating and then resigned, and then he tipped his hat and walked off down the street. Dorothy picked up her crate. She looked at Jasper with those direct green eyes. "I had that managed," she said. "I know you did," he said. "I was just passing." A beat of silence. Then the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was in the direction of one. "I notice you do a lot of passing in useful directions." "Good morning, Miss Bailey," Jasper said and walked back across the street. He rode home with his jaw set and his chest doing something complicated and inconvenient. That night, sitting on his porch with Biscuit asleep across his boots, He looked out at the wide, dark Texas sky and recited his oath to himself quietly, with the same deliberate repetition a man uses to memorize scripture. He would not ask her to stay. He would not ask anyone to stay. He was fine. The ranch was fine. Everything was fine. Biscuit shifted in his sleep, and his tail thumped twice against Jasper's ankle, which seemed on the generous side of supportive. The next Sunday after church, Margaret arranged a gathering at the boarding house, as she did occasionally. Not a formal dinner party, but the kind of easy afternoon where people came and went, and there was lemonade and pie, and the particular pleasant hum of a small community that, for all its hardships and its dust and its heat, had managed to build something that resembled a life together. Dorothy found herself on the front porch beside Jasper, not entirely by accident but not entirely by design either. They had arrived there through the natural drift of a gathering, standing at the rail and looking out at the street, and neither of them moved away. "Tell me about your ranch," Dorothy said. He looked at her. Most people in Calico Flat had stopped asking about the ranch because they had heard about it many times, and the ones who hadn't asked tended not to out of a misguided sensitivity about what had happened with Clara. Dorothy asked as though it were a perfectly natural question, which it was. 340 acres, he said. About 200 head of cattle right now. I run Longhorns primarily, but I have been crossing in some Herefords. They do better in drought conditions. I built the main house 8 years ago. It has 2 bedrooms and a decent kitchen and a porch that faces west. He paused. The sunsets are remarkable. She listened to all of this with her forearms on the rail, looking at the street. What is the hardest part of it? He thought about that honestly. The decisions you have to make alone, he said. When something goes wrong, a fence breaks, or you lose cattle to a bad night, or the well needs digging deeper, you make the decision, you do the work, and there is no one to tell you whether you made the right call. You just keep going and find out later. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. I know something about that, she said. The firm in St. Louis, he said, because Margaret had told him the basic facts, and he thought she might appreciate not having to explain herself. 12 years of careful work, she said. Good books, honest accounts, and then 3 men at the top made bad decisions I had no part in and no warning of, and it was gone. She said it without bitterness, but also without the false brightness that some people put on when they described their misfortunes. She said it the way someone states a fact they have already metabolized. So I understand the feeling of making decisions in a void and living with whatever follows. You do not seem like a person who does a great deal of wallowing, Jasper said. She turned and looked at him, and there was something in the look that was surprised and pleased in equal measure, as though she had not expected to be read that accurately. No, she said, I do not find it particularly useful. Neither do I, he said. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment that stretched and then stretched further, and Jasper became aware of how close she was to him on the narrow porch, and how the late afternoon light was doing something very specific to the color of her hair, and he moved back from the rail and said he needed to see about his horse. He did not need to see about his horse. His horse was fine. But he said good night to Margaret and rode home before sundown, and he was short with himself the entire ride, which Biscuit tolerated with the patience of a dog who had seen this particular mood before and knew it would pass. The following week brought a problem that had nothing to do with Jasper's internal landscape and everything to do with the material reality of running a ranch. A section of fence on the eastern boundary of his property had been cut. Not broken, not worn through cut. Deliberately, with a tool. He found it on his morning round and followed the line of damage for half a mile before he understood what he was looking at. Someone had moved cattle through that gap. Not his cattle. Someone else's cattle had been driven across his land, and whoever had done it at night and done it with the specific intention of not being seen. He rode to town and told Sheriff Holt, who took down the information with the methodical care that was his particular brand of efficiency, and said he would look into it. Jasper went to Haggerty's for his forgotten work gloves. He still had not gotten them and found Dorothy at the counter going over an order with Haggerty himself. The two of them bent over a list with the shared focus of people engaged in the honest work of commerce. She looked up when he came in. "You look like a man who has found trouble," she said. "Fence trouble," he said. "Someone cut a section on my eastern line." Dorothy straightened. Something sharpened in her expression. "That is the third time in 2 months that something like that has happened around here," she said. "Mr. Haggerty had his storage shed broken into. The Prentice family lost 3 horses from their paddock." Jasper looked at Haggerty, who nodded with the resigned expression of a man who has been worried about something he does not know how to fix. "The word around the county," Haggerty said carefully, "is that there is a group of men, 4 or 5 of them, who have been moving through the territory helping themselves to whatever is convenient. They move on before anyone can pin them down." "Does Holt know?" Jasper said. "Holt knows," Dorothy said. "He is doing what he can, but one sheriff with 2 deputies and a territory the size of several eastern states is limited in what he can accomplish." Jasper bought his work gloves. He also bought a new box of rifle cartridges, which was simply practical. That evening, Walt Briggs rode out to the ranch to tell him that 3 of the ranchers in the county, Jasper included, had decided to take turns keeping watch on the eastern approaches. Just 2 men at a time, rotating through. Nothing that would put anyone in serious danger, but enough of a presence to discourage anyone thinking about making free with other people's property. Jasper agreed to the rotation. He and Walt had done similar things before, in the first years when the territory was rougher and the law was thinner, and it was the sensible thing. He was on the second watch rotation, which meant he would be out 2 nights hence, and in the meantime he had his own work to do. The Herefords he had been bringing in needed to be checked, and the south pasture needed the irrigation channel cleared, and he had a barn door that had been hanging wrong for a month. He was working on the barn door the next afternoon when he heard a horse on his road and looked up to see Dorothy Bailey riding toward him on the bay mare that Margaret kept for errands. He set down his tools and waited. She rode well, not showily, but competently, the way people who have actually spent time on horses ride. She pulled up in front of the barn and looked down at him with an expression that was simultaneously purposeful and slightly uncertain. "Margaret sent you?" he asked. "No," she said. "I came on my own. I hope that is all right." "It is your prerogative," he said, and waited. She swung down from the horse and tied the mare to the hitching rail with the easy practiced motion of someone who did not require help with horses. Then she stood and looked at him directly, and Jasper braced himself in the way that a man braces for something he cannot predict. "I wanted to see your land," she said. "You described it and I wanted to see it. That is the whole of it." He stared at her for a moment. Then something in his chest shifted in a way he was going to spend the rest of the evening pretending had not happened. "All right," he said. "Come on, then." He showed her the south pasture and the irrigation channel he was clearing and the east boundary, where the fence had been cut and was now repaired. He showed her the cattle, the longhorns with their enormous horns and their magnificent complete indifference to human opinion, and the 3 Herefords he had brought in recently who were still adjusting to the world. She walked beside him and asked good questions, specific questions, the kind that came from genuine attention and not politeness. She asked about the water situation. It had been a dry year, and the creek that fed his main water supply was running lower than it should. She asked about the cattle market and what the prices had been like coming out of the previous winter. She asked about the Herefords specifically, and when he explained his reasoning about drought resistance, she nodded in a way that meant she was genuinely thinking about what he said, not just receiving it. "You know about cattle," he said. "My father had a farm," she said. "Not in Texas, Indiana, much smaller, but the logic of it is the same, more or less. Land needs water, animals need land, people need animals, and if any one part of that chain breaks, everything downstream breaks with it." "Your father farmed," Jasper said. "He did. He was very good at it." She paused. "He died when I was 19. My mother 2 years later. The farm went to debts. She said this with the same factual tone she had used about the dry goods firm. "That is when I went to St. Louis and learned to keep books." Jasper was quiet for a moment. He thought about a 19-year-old girl losing her father and the farm and everything that had organized her world, and then 2 years later losing her mother, and then building a careful life with her hands and her intelligence, only to have it dissolve through no fault of her own. He thought about resilience and the price it cost, and the fact that some people wore their resilience the way Dorothy Bailey wore it, not as armor exactly, but as simple fact. "I am sorry," he said. "Thank you," she said, and meant it and left it there. They had reached the west side of his property by then, and the sun was beginning to make its approach toward the horizon, and the sky was doing what it did in the evenings out here, going through that extraordinary slow burning transformation from blue to gold to orange to the deep incredible red that had no real name. Dorothy stopped walking. She stood and looked at the sky the way some people look at music, with her whole self turned toward it. "You said the sunsets were remarkable," she said softly. "I did. You were not overstating." They stood side by side watching it for a long while, and the silence between them was entirely comfortable, which was unusual for Jasper, who was comfortable in solitary silence but less practiced in the shared kind. "I should get back before dark," she said finally. "I will ride with you to the main road," he said. "You do not have to." "No," he said, "but I will." She looked at him sideways as they walked back toward the barn, and there was something in the look that was evaluating and warm in equal measure, the way green light comes through leaves, both things at once. He rode with her to the main road and watched until she was far enough along that he could reasonably turn back. And then he sat on his horse for another minute watching a cloud of dust that was Dorothy Bailey riding away, and thought about the fact that she had come out here on her own initiative, because she wanted to see his land, and that she had stood next to him watching the sunset as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And he told his oath firmly and clearly that it was still intact, and he meant every word of it. His horse, a gray gelding named Colt who had known him for 7 years and had opinions, made a small derisive sound and shook his mane. "You stay out of it," Jasper told him. The night watch came and went without incident. Jasper and Walt spent 4 cold hours on the eastern ridge and saw nothing more alarming than a coyote who was offended by their presence, and they rode home at dawn with nothing to report. Sheriff Holt increased his patrols, and there were no further fence cuttings or incidents for the next 2 weeks, and the general sense in Calico Flat was that whoever had been troublesome had moved on to some other territory. Life resumed its normal pace, and its normal pace increasingly included Dorothy Bailey. She had taken over the bookkeeping for the Calico house with the thoroughness of a person who found disordered accounts personally offensive, and within a month she had reorganized Margaret's finances in a way that revealed 3 unnecessary expenditures and 1 significant error in the town's billing records that had cost Margaret money for 2 years. She told Margaret about this without drama, and Margaret looked at the corrected numbers and said, "I want you to stay permanently." Dorothy smiled at this and said she was glad to be useful. She had also, without anyone appointing her to the position, become the person in Calico Flat who understood numbers. Old Mr. Packard needed help understanding the letter from his bank in Dallas. Dorothy sat with him one afternoon and translated the financial language into plain speech and helped him write a response. The Prentice family, recovering from the loss of their horses, was negotiating with a buyer in San Antonio. Dorothy looked at the proposed terms and told them politely that they were being offered about 60% of fair value and showed them why. Word traveled, the way word does in small communities, and by the end of her 2nd month in Calico Flat, people were coming to the Calico house to ask Dorothy Bailey to look at their correspondence and their contracts the same way they went to Doc Renner when they had a physical ailment. Jasper watched this happen from a moderate distance, because the distance was the sensible place to be, and found himself simultaneously proud of her, which was an entirely irrational emotion to have about a woman who was in no way his to be proud of, and deeply interested in everything she did and said and thought, which was a problem. The situation clarified itself on a Thursday afternoon in late September. Jasper had come to the boarding house to return a book he had borrowed from Margaret. She had an excellent small library and was generous with it, and found Dorothy on the porch alone, reading, with her shoes off and her feet tucked under her on the porch chair in a posture of absolute comfort. She looked up when he came up the steps, and there was no self-consciousness in being caught comfortable. She simply looked at him with the same direct attention she gave everything. "Margaret is at the church auxiliary meeting," she said. "She will be back in an hour. I can give her the book." Jasper set the book on the porch rail. "He should have said thank you and left," he said. "What are you reading?" She showed him the cover. It was a volume of essays on the settlement of the Western Territories, not romantic writing, not fiction, but the real thing, the detailed and often dry accounting of how people built lives in difficult land. "Heavy reading," he said. "I like knowing how things actually work," she said. "Not the version people tell in the East with the adventure and the romance of it. The real version, how people managed water rights and cattle crossings and weather and each other." She paused. "The real version is more interesting anyway." He sat down on the porch steps, which was further than he intended to go, and she did not seem surprised by this. "Do you miss St. Louis?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I miss the library," she said. "They had a good lending library, and I miss the music. There were concerts occasionally that were lovely. But do I miss the life I had there? No. The life I had there was narrow." She looked out at the street. "It fit my circumstances at the time, which were narrow. But I have always been more than my circumstances." She said this without arrogance, simply as fact. "You have," Jasper said before he could think better of it. She looked at him. The afternoon light was long and amber-colored, and it was doing absolutely everything to her face, and Jasper held himself very still. "You know," she said, "you are considerably less terrifying than advertised." "What was the advertisement?" "Oh, the usual, that you kept to yourself and preferred it that way, that you were polite but not approachable, that you had history that had made you careful." She said this with the careful, neutral tone of someone who is being accurate but not unkind. "All true," he said. "Mostly true," she said. "The careful part is definitely accurate, but you are approachable. You are just selective about who you approach." She met his eyes. "I notice you have approached me." Jasper was quiet for a moment. A wagon went past on the street. Somewhere down the block someone was hammering. "I noticed that too," he said. Dorothy unfolded herself from the chair and put her feet on the floor and leaned her forearms on the porch rail, looking at the street, giving him some air, which he appreciated without being able to say so. "I am not Clara Simmons," she said quietly to the street. The name hit him the way names from that particular part of his past always did, with a dull, specific ache that was less about the woman herself and more about the architecture of what she had taught him. "No," he said, "you are not." "I do not know what happened in full," Dorothy said. "I know the outline. Calico Flat is not a large town and people are not always discreet, but I do not know the truth of it and I would not pretend to." She paused. "I only say I am not her because I think perhaps you look at me sometimes and see a version of that history playing out again, and I want you to know that I see it differently." Jasper stood up from the porch steps. Not because he was leaving, but because sitting felt suddenly insufficient for the conversation they were having. "How do you see it differently?" he said. She turned from the railing and looked at him straight. "I came here with 2 trunks," she said. "I am unpacking those trunks. I'm putting my things away in drawers and hanging my dresses in the wardrobe and setting my books on the shelf. Not because anyone asked me to, and not because I have made any promises, but because I do not do things halfway. When I am somewhere, I am there. And I am here." Something was happening in Jasper's chest that was large and complicated and very hard to manage. "Dorothy," he said. "I am not asking anything of you," she said quickly, and the quickness of it told him she was not as perfectly composed as she appeared. I only wanted you to know that when I look at you, I see a man worth knowing. Not a cautionary tale, not someone to feel sorry for. Just someone worth knowing." He looked at her for a long moment, the amber light, the wide quiet street, the smell of dust and heat, and somewhere the faint ghost of her lavender soap. "Would you have dinner with me?" he said. "Not here, at the Aldersons, on Saturday." The Aldersons was a small restaurant 2 streets over that did a passable steak and an excellent apple pie, and was, in the context of Calico Flat, the place you went when you meant something. Dorothy looked at him for just a fraction of a second longer than a casual response would have required. Then she smiled, a full, unreserved smile that started in her eyes and moved outward, and said, "Yes, I would like that very much." He walked home. His horse was at the livery, but he walked anyway, with his hands in his pockets, and a feeling in his chest that was equal parts exhilarating and terrifying, which was, he supposed, exactly what this feeling was supposed to be. Saturday came. Jasper wore his good shirt, the dark blue one he kept for occasions, and arrived at the Calico house with a small bunch of wildflowers that he had picked from the field east of town, because he was not the sort of man who could bring himself to buy flowers from a shop, but he was also apparently not the sort of man who could bring himself to arrive empty-handed. Dorothy opened the door. She was wearing a green dress the color of the shade under creek willows, and her hair was up in a way that was neat and thoughtful and had clearly required some effort, and she looked at the wildflowers with an expression that was entirely genuine. "You picked those," she said. "From the east field," he said. "The sunflowers are finishing, but the Indian paintbrush is still going." "I prefer picked to bought," she said, and took them from him with both hands. They walked to the Aldersons through the warm September evening with the stars beginning to appear overhead, the big Texas stars that were different from any other stars in Dorothy's experience, closer and more numerous and arranged with what seemed like deliberate extravagance. "I grew up thinking stars were something that happened on clear nights," she said, looking up. "Out here they happen every night." "You get used to it," Jasper said. "I do not think I will," she said. "I think some things should not be gotten used to." Dinner was easy in the way that dinner is easy when two people are genuinely interested in each other, and have also had enough practice in life to be comfortable in conversation without filling every silence. They talked about the county, and about the water situation, which was worsening, and about the territorial politics that were slowly and messily moving toward statehood. They talked about books and about horses and about the particular challenges of building anything worthwhile in a place that could be harsh and unforgiving. "Why did you come here?" Dorothy asked. "Why Calico Flat specifically?" "I followed the land," Jasper said. "I came west from Tennessee when I was 22. I had enough money to buy a small parcel, and I wanted somewhere that had room to grow. I looked at a map and I read about the grasslands, and I made a decision." He turned his fork over in his hands. "It was right as decisions go. The land is good. The community is good. I have not regretted it. Even in the hard years," she said. He met her eyes. "Even then." She held his gaze for a moment. There was a question in it that she was not asking directly, which he understood, and which he was not yet ready to answer directly, and she seemed to understand that too. "Tell me something about Tennessee," she said instead, and he did. They walked back slowly, taking the long way around past the edge of town where the plains opened up and the night sky was enormous above them. Their arms were close together as they walked, and then at some point, neither of them noted precisely when, their hands were close together, and then his hand found hers, and she turned her palm up to meet it, and they walked the rest of the way holding hands with the casual naturalness of something that had been inevitable all along. At the Calico house door, they stopped. "Thank you," Dorothy said. "That was a lovely evening." "It was," he agreed. He was holding her hand still, both of them aware of it. He looked at her. The porch light was doing something warm to her face, and there was a small smile at the corner of her mouth that was not quite public yet, still in the process of deciding whether to commit. He leaned forward and kissed her, briefly, softly, with the reverence of a man who understands that some things are not to be rushed. She kissed him back with equal care, and it was nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just two people in the warm Texas night acknowledging something that had been growing between them for 2 months. "Good night, Jasper," she said. "Good night, Dorothy," he said. He walked back to the livery with his hands in his pockets and a feeling in his chest so large and warm it was almost alarming, and the oath that he had held for 2 years was less like a solid thing and more like smoke now, breaking apart in the night air, drifting away above the rooftops of Calico Flat. He did not say so out loud. He was not quite ready to say so out loud, but he knew. October in Calico Flat brought the first cool mornings and the smell of wood smoke and the beginning of the fall cattle drive preparations, which meant Jasper was busier than at any other time of year. He had 40 head to move to the buyer in Fort Worth, which meant hiring 2 temporary hands, checking every inch of his equipment, and spending a week doing the kind of exhausting necessary work that was the actual substance of what he did. He and Dorothy settled into something that was careful but steady. He came to town twice a week rather than once, and one of those visits always included time with Dorothy. Sometimes it was dinner at the Aldersons. Sometimes it was simply sitting on the Calico house porch in the evening, and once it was a Saturday afternoon when she came out to the ranch again, and this time actually helped him, with her sleeves rolled up and no concern for her dress sorting, and documenting the cattle he was preparing to move. She had a natural instinct for organizing information that translated beautifully to the chaos of pre-drive preparations, and by the end of the afternoon the tally was accurate and organized in a way that would have taken Jasper twice as long alone. "You have done this before," he said. "I told you my father farmed," she said. "You undersold the farming," he said. She smiled and rolled her sleeve back down and accepted the cup of water he brought her with the comfortable ease of a person who is not on her best behavior but simply on her actual behavior, which was better. "Dorothy," he said, and then stopped. She looked at him, waiting. There were things he wanted to say. They were large things, and they had been building for weeks, and the problem was that saying them meant moving past the oath in a definitive, irreversible way. And he could admit this to himself, standing in his own barn on his own land, still afraid. "You are very good at this," he said, which was not what he had been going to say, but it was true. She held his gaze for a moment, and she saw the unspoken thing he knew she did, because Dorothy Bailey missed very little and she did not push. She said, "Thank you," and began gathering up the papers. He rode into town beside her as the sun went down and the air turned clean and cool, and somewhere between the ranch road and the main street, he reached over and took her hand where it rested on her saddle horn, and she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they rode into Calico Flat like that together, in the long gold light of the evening. Walt Briggs saw them from outside the feed store, and made a face that was equal parts triumph and told you so that Jasper elected to ignore completely. The cattle drive took him away for 2 weeks. He left in mid-October with his 2 hired hands brothers from a family named Tanner who were competent and easy to work with, and drove his 40 head northeast toward Fort Worth across the rolling grasslands that he had ridden so many times they were mapped in his body, not just his mind. He thought about Dorothy Bailey for approximately the first 3 days with a frequency that he found embarrassing, and then settled into the rhythm of the work, which was physical and absorbing and necessary, and thought about her with a somewhat more manageable regularity for the remaining 11. He wrote her a letter from Fort Worth. It was not a long letter or a particularly eloquent one. He was not a man given to elaborate written expression, but it was honest, which he thought was more valuable. He told her the drive had gone well. He told her Fort Worth was noisy and crowded, and he was ready to come home. He told her he had walked past a bookshop and thought of her, and had sent a book with the letter that he thought she might like. The book was a collection of writings about women who had come west as settlers and farmers and builders of communities, their own accounts of that experience. He had stood in the Fort Worth bookshop for 7 minutes deciding whether to send it, and then concluded that it said what he meant to say, which was that he saw her clearly, and that what he saw was specific and extraordinary and worth naming. He got back to Calico Flat on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, tired and dusty, and well satisfied with the price he had gotten for his cattle. Dorothy was waiting on the boarding house porch when he rode past, and she came down the steps before he had fully stopped his horse. "You are back," she said. "I am back," he said, climbing down from Colt. She was looking at him with a directness that was even more charged than usual, and he realized with the particular certainty of a man who has been alone for 2 weeks and returned to something he did not want to leave again, that everything was clear. The oath was gone. He was not grieving it. It had served its purpose, which was to protect a wounded thing long enough for it to heal, and now he was healed or near enough, and Dorothy Bailey was standing in front of him with her green eyes and her direct attention and the book he had sent tucked under her arm. "I like the book very much," she said. "I thought you might." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You know, when I began unpacking my first trunk, the night I arrived, Margaret asked me how long I planned to stay. And I told her I did not know yet. And now," he said, she looked at him. "Now I have unpacked both trunks," she said. "Every last thing. My books are on the shelf. My grandmother's quilt is on the bed. My mother's photograph is on the windowsill." She held his gaze. "I am here, Jasper." He was quiet for a moment, and the evening air was still and warm, and Biscuit, who had been tied up in front of the general store and spotted Jasper from a distance, came barreling down the street with his whole back end wagging. "I know you are," Jasper said. He stepped toward her. "And I am glad you are. More glad than I have been about anything in a very long time." Dorothy smiled, the full, unreserved kind, and when Biscuit arrived between them in a small explosion of enthusiasm, she laughed and bent to greet the dog, and Jasper stood watching her and felt the last corner of the oath dissolve into the evening like smoke, like it had never been there at all. He knew in that moment, with the absolute certainty that came to him rarely but always correctly when it came, that he was in love with Dorothy Bailey. Had been, probably, for longer than he was currently comfortable admitting. Would be, with every probability, for the rest of his life. He did not say all of that on the street in front of the Calico house while his dog celebrated his return. But he held her hand all through dinner that evening, and when he walked her to the door he held her face in his hands and looked at her and said, "I have been thinking about you every day for 2 weeks." "I know," she said softly. "How do you know?" "Because I have been thinking about you every day for 2 weeks," she said. He kissed her in the porch light with more conviction than the first time, with the certainty of a man who has made a decision and is not looking back, and she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. November arrived and the weather turned, and life in Calico Flat took on the particular character of a frontier community preparing for winter, which meant everyone was busier and closer and more thoroughly dependent on each other than in the easier months. Firewood needed to be laid in, stores checked, roofs reinforced before the cold rains came. Jasper spent 3 days in November repairing Margaret's roof again, different section, different problem. And Dorothy brought him coffee and lunch, and sat on the top rung of the ladder below him at one point to read him a passage from a letter she had received from a wholesale supplier in Dallas, who was proposing terms that she considered unreasonable. He gave his opinion on the terms from the roof. She agreed with him. They argued pleasantly about the negotiating position for 20 minutes before reaching the same conclusion, and she went back inside satisfied. Walt Briggs found this scene deeply amusing and reported it to Nora, who declared it the most promising thing she had seen in years. It was in mid-November that Rex Holt returned to Calico Flat. He had been away for 2 months, his usual circuit having taken him further afield than normal, and when he came back and found Dorothy's situation considerably changed, her presence at the Calico house now permanent, her relationship with Jasper visible and established. He handled it with considerably less grace than ideally would have been the case. He made a comment at the general store, with several people present, that was indirect in its insult but specific in its target, implying that Dorothy had come west without prospects and had attached herself to the most available man. Dorothy, who was standing 5 feet away, heard every word. She turned and looked at Rex Holt with an expression that had the flat, particular quality of absolute calm, the kind that is not absence of feeling but presence of complete control. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I came west with my own savings, my own skills, and my own intentions. I have been earning my living independently in this town since I arrived, and I make my own choices. I would suggest that your opinion of those choices is of no interest to me, and that you might spend the energy you currently invest in other people's affairs on something more useful to yourself." She turned back to Haggerty and completed her transaction. Rex Holt left the store without further comment. Haggerty later told this story to everyone who came in for the next week. Jasper heard about it that evening and felt something that was pride and love in such equal measure they were indistinguishable. He thought about going to find Rex Holt and explaining his view of the matter in terms that did not admit of interpretation, and then thought about Dorothy's face as she handled the situation herself and decided that she had managed it precisely as she would want it managed, and that adding his intervention would be redundant at best and condescending at worst. He told her as much when he saw her. She looked pleased. "You are learning," she said. "I am trying," he said. They were sitting in the Calico house parlor. Margaret and Earl had retired early, and the fire was burning low and warm, and Dorothy was going over the boarding house accounts while Jasper read, which was a thing they had begun doing in the evenings, with the comfortable naturalness of people who have discovered that proximity is itself a kind of pleasure. Jasper put his book down and looked at her bent over her ledger, the firelight doing everything it could in her hair, her pen moving with the quick focused motion that meant she was deep in concentration. "Dorothy," he said. She said, not looking up. "Stop for a moment," he said. She looked up. She put the pen down. He was quiet for a moment, holding what he was about to say in his hands like something breakable, weighing it. "I was going to say something formal," he said, "but I do not do formal particularly well, so I am going to say it plain." She waited. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for a while. I did not say it sooner because I was working through some things, old things, and you gave me the time to do that without demanding more than I was ready for, which is not a small thing." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to stay. Not because Margaret needs help with the accounts, and not because you have unpacked your trunks, and not because this town is better with you in it, though all of those things are true. I want you to stay because I love you and my life is considerably better and truer and larger with you in it." Dorothy looked at him for a long, full moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the November wind moved around the eaves of the Calico house. "I had a speech prepared," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "You prepared a speech," he said. "I am an organized person," she said. "I thought I might need one." She folded her hands on the ledger and looked at him with those green eyes that had seen him clearly from the first day. "I love you too, Jasper. I knew it, really knew it, when you sent me that book from Fort Worth. Not because it was romantic, though it was, but because it told me that you had been paying attention to who I actually was, and that was the thing that I needed most." He crossed the room and sat beside her on the settee and took both her hands in his, and she looked at him with the full warmth of a woman who has decided and is certain and is not pretending otherwise, and he kissed her with everything he had. The decision to marry was not dramatic. It arose the way correct decisions arise between two people who have been genuinely honest with each other gradually, naturally, with the sense of arriving somewhere that was always the destination. He asked her on a December morning, with the first cold of winter proper in the air and the ground silvered with frost. They were standing at the fence line of the west pasture where he had shown her the sunsets, and the sky was a clear, hard winter blue, and he said, "I want to build something with you. Not just run the ranch alone, build it together. Will you marry me?" She turned and looked at him, and the cold air made her cheeks bright and her breath came in small clouds. "Yes," she said. "I have been waiting for you to ask." "How long?" he said. "About 3 weeks," she said, with the corner of her mouth moving. "That long?" he said. "You are a deliberate man," she said. "I respect that." He laughed, a full, genuine laugh that startled a crow out of the fence post 20 feet away, and pulled her into his arms, and she pressed her face against his chest, and he held her in the cold morning air with his land around them and the sky enormous overhead, and something in him that had been braced for a very long time finally, quietly, came down. They were married in late January of 1880, in the church in Calico Flat on a bright cold day with the whole town in attendance, because it was the kind of event that a small community takes personally. Walt Briggs served as Jasper's best man and looked insufferably satisfied throughout the entire ceremony. Margaret wept once, efficiently, and then composed herself and spent the rest of the day running the reception at the Calico house with the same organizational mastery she brought to everything. Dorothy wore her mother's brooch on a cream-colored dress she had made with Nora Briggs's assistance, and when Jasper saw her walking toward him down the aisle he understood, for the first time in his adult life, the thing people meant when they described feeling like the luckiest man in the room. She took her vows with the same direct certainty she brought to everything looking at him, meaning every word, not performing emotion but genuinely having it. He took his vows the same way. The Reverend, who was a no-nonsense man of deep faith and very little sentimentality, declared them married and allowed himself one small smile before returning to his proper expression. Walt shook Jasper's hand with both of his and said, "Finally," and Jasper said, "Stay out of it," and Walt laughed and clapped him on the shoulder and went to find his wife. Dorothy became Dorothy Carver on a January afternoon in 1880, which was a fact she turned over in her mind for the first few days the way one turns over a satisfying stone, appreciating its solidity. She moved out to the ranch in early February, when the worst of the winter weather had passed. She brought her 2 trunks, which she had repacked at the Calico house with the same care she had originally unpacked them, and several additional boxes of books and supplies that had accumulated over the months. Jasper watched her unpack in the bedroom of the house he had built with his own hands, setting her grandmother's quilt on the bed and her mother's photograph on the windowsill just as she had described, arranging her books on the shelf he had already cleared for them, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe with the careful organization of a woman who has decided precisely where everything belongs. He was leaning in the doorway watching this, and it occurred to him with the full force of a truth that had been making itself known gradually and was now simply self-evident, that the oath he had sworn 2 years ago, the absolute ironclad promise he had made to himself alone in the dark, had vanished so completely that he could barely remember the texture of it. Not because Dorothy had argued him out of it, not because he had reasoned his way past it, but because she had arrived and she had started unpacking, and the house had become something different, and he had simply forgotten that there was ever a reason for the oath in the first place. "What are you smiling at?" Dorothy said without turning around. "Was I smiling?" he said. "You were," she said. She turned and looked at him. "That particular smile means you are thinking something you consider somewhat embarrassing." "It does not," he said. "It absolutely does," she said. "I have catalogued your smiles." "You have catalogued my smiles," he repeated. "I am an organized person," she said, and turned back to her unpacking. He crossed the room and came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him with the easy naturalness of a woman who has already decided that this is exactly where she belongs. "I swore once," he said into her hair, "that I would never ask another woman to stay." She was quiet for a moment, listening. "I did not ask you," he said. "You just started unpacking and I forgot completely that I had ever made the oath." She turned in his arms and looked up at him. "That is either very romantic or a sign of a very poor memory," she said. "Both, possibly," he said. She smiled the full, unreserved, absolutely genuine smile, and kissed him. And outside the window of the bedroom they had made together, the winter sun was cutting long gold lines across the Texas grassland, and Biscuit was barking at something in the south pasture. Probably nothing, probably everything. And the ranch house that had been built for one and had lived as though it were waiting was finally, properly, completely full. Spring came to the Carver ranch in slow, insistent waves. The creek came up with the snowmelt from far north, and the south pasture went green, and the calves arrived in the way they always did, with no respect for convenient hours, at dawn and at midnight, requiring Jasper's attention and often Dorothy's alongside him. She was not a woman who stood back from the difficult parts. When he came in at 3 in the morning for help with a calf that was presenting badly, she was up and dressed before he finished explaining, and she worked beside him in the lamplight of the barn with a steadiness that he had suspected but was still grateful to witness. "You have done this before," he said again. "Third time you have said that to me," she said, working. "Third time it has been true," he said. "The calf made it." They sat in the straw afterward, leaning against the barn wall, exhausted and hay-covered, while the mother and calf sorted themselves out in the lamplight, and Dorothy put her head on his shoulder and was asleep in approximately 4 minutes. He sat there for a long while, not sleeping, looking at the mother and calf and the lamp and the barn wall, listening to his wife breathe beside him, and felt the uncomplicated fullness of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. Spring also brought the resolution of the cattle-moving problem that had plagued the county the previous autumn. Sheriff Holt, methodical as always, had been building a picture for months, and in March he and his deputies, with the assistance of a marshal sent from the county seat, apprehended the 4 men responsible, 2 of whom turned out to be passing through from New Mexico, one of whom was a man who had been doing minor work at various local ranches under a false name, and one of whom, to no one's great pleasure, was a nephew of one of the county council members, which created a political difficulty that kept Calico Flat in vigorous conversation for several weeks. Jasper had lost a total of 6 cattle to the operation, which was recovered in value by the restitution the convicted men were ordered to pay. It was not a large amount, but it was the principle of it, and having the matter closed and the men accountable was, as he told Dorothy, worth more than the money. Dorothy agreed, and noted in addition that the county should probably be having a larger conversation about law enforcement resources relative to territory size, and that she intended to write to the county seat on the subject. He told her to do exactly that. She did, and received a polite response that was bureaucratic in its lack of commitment, but did eventually result in an additional deputy being funded for the Eastern District, which was something. Summer arrived burning and beautiful and relentless, and the ranch expanded. Jasper bought 40 additional acres on his eastern boundary from a man who was leaving the territory for California, and Dorothy negotiated the purchase with a cool competence that got him a better price than he had been prepared to accept, which he found both useful and impressive and somewhat humbling. "You could have told me you were going to do that," he said afterward. "I did not want to build it up in case it did not work," she said. "Were you unhappy with the result?" "No," he said. "Then let me have this," she said, which was so perfectly reasonable that he laughed and conceded completely. She had also, by midsummer, begun working formally with 3 additional businesses in Calico Flat on their accounts, which she did from the ranch on Tuesdays and Thursdays when she rode into town. She was building, with the same quiet, methodical competence she brought to everything, exactly the kind of work and life she had always been capable of and now had the space to pursue. Jasper watched this with a deep, specific pride. He watched her ride into Calico Flat on those Tuesday mornings with her ledger under her arm and her hair pinned against the wind, and he thought that she was the most capable person he had ever known, and also the person he most wanted to come home to in the evenings, and that these things were not in any tension with each other at all. In August of 1880, she told him, in the kitchen over breakfast, turning her coffee cup in her hands in the way that meant she was working up to something, that she was expecting their first child. He was standing at the stove and he turned around and looked at her. She met his eyes with the look that he had come to know as her real look, underneath the competence and the composure and the directness, the fully exposed person who was also, in certain moments, allowing herself to feel the size of the thing. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her face in his hands and said, "Dorothy," just her name, just that. She covered his hands with hers and said, "I know," and that was enough. Doc Renner confirmed the matter that same week and pronounced Dorothy in excellent health, and told Jasper with some amusement that he had seen more anxious prospective fathers in his 20 years of practice, but not many. "I am not anxious," Jasper said. "No," Doc Renner agreed pleasantly. "Of course not." The pregnancy went smoothly through the fall, which was a mercy, because fall at the ranch was busy. Jasper had more cattle than the previous year, the 2 additional hands he had hired through the summer were working out well, and the expanded acreage meant fencing work that went on well into October. Dorothy continued her work in town through October, reducing slightly in November, and continued managing the ranch accounts with the thoroughness that had become essential to the operation. She had reorganized Jasper's entire bookkeeping in the first 6 months of their marriage in a way that revealed precisely where money was being lost and precisely how to stop losing it, and the ranch's financial picture by the end of 1880 was considerably stronger than it had been at the start. "I know cattle," Jasper said, reviewing the year-end numbers in December. "I did not know I needed to also understand spreadsheet accounting." "You did not need to," Dorothy said comfortably. "You needed to marry someone who did." "A self-serving argument," he said. "Accurate, though," she said. He kissed her temple and went back to the numbers. Their son was born on the 14th of February, 1881, in the bedroom of the ranch house with Doc Renner present and Margaret Holt, who had come out from town 3 days prior in anticipation. Jasper spent most of the labor in the kitchen being firmly and compassionately excluded from the bedroom by Margaret, which he understood was both for practical and temperamental reasons. When Doc Renner came out and told him he had a son and that Dorothy was well, Jasper sat down in the kitchen chair and put his hands over his face for a moment that was private and large, and not something he was going to describe to anyone. When they let him in, Dorothy was propped against the pillows with her hair down, and the particular exhausted radiance of a woman who has done something enormous and knows it. She was holding the baby with the careful certainty of a new mother, who is also a person of natural competence. And she looked up at Jasper when he came in with an expression that was more open and more full than anything he had ever seen on any human face. He sat on the edge of the bed and she held the baby out to him, and he took his son small and certain and making small indignant sounds about the state of the world in his arms. "He looks like you," Dorothy said. "Does he?" Jasper said. Was looking at the small face with an expression he was not managing at all. "He has your frown," she said. "Babies all frown," he said. "This is specifically your frown," she said. He looked up at her and she was smiling the full smile, the unreserved one, the one that started in her eyes, and he leaned forward and kissed her forehead very gently and said, "Thank you." "What for?" she said. "For staying," he said. She covered his hand with hers. "I told you," she said. "When I am somewhere, I am there." They named the boy Thomas, for Jasper's father, with James as the middle name for Dorothy's. Thomas James Carver, who arrived in the world with the frown of a contemplative man and the lungs of a champion, and who from his first days seemed to have a great deal of opinion about his circumstances and no hesitation about expressing it. Walt Briggs came out that Sunday and stood at the fence looking at the ranch with his thumbs in his belt loops and said, "You know, when you were sitting on that post outside Haggerty's watching a woman get off a stagecoach and pretending you were just passing, I thought to myself, that man has no idea what is about to happen to him." Jasper, who was standing beside him with Thomas in the crook of his arm, said, "I was picking up cornmeal." "You forgot the cornmeal," Walt said. "I got the gloves," Jasper said. "Eventually," Walt said. Jasper looked down at his son, who was awake and regarding the Texas sky with the deep seriousness of someone encountering it for the first time. "Walt," he said. "Yes. Go away." Walt laughed and went away. Dorothy came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside Jasper and looked at the pasture where the cattle were moving slowly in the late morning sun, and the sky was doing what it always did, enormous and blue and indifferent to everything except its own beauty. "He likes the sky," she said, looking at Thomas. "I know," Jasper said. "He gets that from you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The ranch was alive around them, all 340 acres of it, the cattle and the grass and the creek and the fence lines and the barn where a calf had been born in the straw while his wife slept against his shoulder, and the house he had built with his own hands that had finally, properly, become what a house was supposed to be. 2 years later, on a bright October morning in 1883, Dorothy told him she was expecting again, with the same turned coffee cup manner as before, and his response this time was immediate and unguarded. He pulled her into his arms and lifted her off the floor, which she told him firmly was not appropriate given the circumstances, and he put her down and kissed her instead, which she accepted as adequate. Their second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1884, healthy and demanding, and inclined from her earliest weeks to observe everything with the particular green-eyed focus that was entirely her mother's. They named her Margaret Alina, for 2 women who had built things that mattered, and who were both present at the naming and both completely composed about it, Margaret in particular being entirely dry-eyed and not even slightly moved, except for the period of approximately 3 minutes during which she stood by the window with her back to the room. Thomas, who was 3, regarded his sister with the combination of suspicion and fascination that constituted the full range of his current emotional vocabulary, and then decided she was acceptable and appointed himself her defender with a seriousness that would, over the years, become one of his most consistent characteristics. Calico Flat grew through those years, the way towns in the territory were growing, more slowly than the boosters claimed and more steadily than the doubters predicted. A second general store opened. The church got a proper bell. The schoolhouse that had been built in 1881 took on a second teacher, and Dorothy had been instrumental in that, not loudly, not through public campaigns, but through the kind of steady, documented persuasion that she brought to every important matter, presenting the county board with figures and needs and proposals that were hard to argue with and harder to ignore. The injustice that sat at the edge of those years, the one that Dorothy noticed and named in her letters and in her conversations with the people she trusted, was the slow erasure of the Comanche and other peoples from the lands that had been theirs, lands whose very character and water knowledge and grazing patterns the settlers depended on, often without acknowledging it. She said this in her letters to the county seat. She said it to Jasper on evenings when the papers were full of the news of the territory, and he agreed with her, having seen enough of what displacement looked like up close to have no illusions about its cost. There were no easy answers to it. There were no answers at all, some nights. But Dorothy believed that naming things accurately was itself a form of integrity, and Jasper believed that a person who saw clearly and said so was worth everything, and they carried the weight of it the way honest people carry the weight of the world they live in without pretending it is not there. The ranch in 1885 was a different creature from the one Jasper had been running alone in 1879. 340 acres had become 520, with the additional acreage acquired carefully over 4 years. The herd had grown to well over 200 head of the crossbred cattle that were handling the Texas, whether better than pure longhorns. He had 3 permanent hands and a bunkhouse that Dorothy had helped design practically, for airflow and insulation, with the unemotional logic she applied to all structural questions. She had, by 1885, formalized her bookkeeping work into a small practice that served 7 businesses in Calico Flat and 2 ranches besides their own. She did this work at a desk in the room off the main bedroom that had originally been a storage room and had been converted at her suggestion into what she called her office, and Jasper called her kingdom, which she accepted as accurate. Thomas was 4 and wild in the outdoors, following Jasper around the ranch with the miniature seriousness of a child who has decided that the business of cattle and land is the most important business there is. He had Jasper's frown and Dorothy's eyes, and a combination of both their stubbornness that promised interesting years ahead. Margaret Elena was one, unsteady on her feet but profoundly determined, pulling herself up on furniture and releasing with complete confidence, and falling on her well-padded bottom, and looking at the floor with an expression that suggested she blamed the floor and was noting this grievance for future reference. On a November evening in 1885, 6 years after Dorothy Bailey had climbed off a stagecoach in Calico Flat with a trunk so heavy it took 2 men to move, Jasper and Dorothy sat on the west porch of the ranch house watching the sunset. It was doing everything it always did. The sky was going through its extraordinary transformation, blue to gold to orange to the deep burning red, the same sky that had taken Dorothy's breath the first time she had seen it, and that still, she had told him, never quite became ordinary. Thomas had fallen asleep inside after dinner, which was unusual for him. Margaret Elena was asleep in her crib, which was normal for her. The ranch was quiet in the way it was quiet in the evenings, not silent but settled, the sound of cattle in the pasture and the creek moving and the dog dreaming on the porch boards. Dorothy was sitting with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and the late light was in her hair still auburn, still slightly escaping its pins, because it had always done that and probably always would, and she was looking at the sky with the expression of a person who has everything they came for and a great deal more besides. Jasper reached over and took her hand. She turned to look at him, and there was the full warmth of it in her face, 6 years of it, accumulated and particular and entirely, specifically his. "I was thinking," she said, "about the day I arrived." "Were you?" he said. "I had no idea what I was walking into," she said. "I had no idea about this sky or this land or the way a sunset looks from the west porch of a ranch house in Texas." She paused. "I had no idea about you. And if you had known," he said. She considered this with the honest gravity she brought to real questions. "I would have come sooner," she said. He turned her hand over in his and looked at it, the ink stain still there, faint now but permanent, on the inside of her right wrist. He pressed his thumb against it gently. "I am grateful," he said, "that you started unpacking." She looked at him with the corner of her mouth moving. "I always unpack," she said. "I told you I do not do things halfway." "I know," he said. "I know it now." The sun touched the horizon and began its last descent, and the sky went the extraordinary deep red that had no name. And below it, the land spread out in all directions, rich and difficult and entirely theirs. And Jasper Carver sat on his porch with his wife's hand in his and their children asleep inside, and a life that had been built from nothing and loss and determination into something solid and true and full, and thought that the oath he had made alone in the dark, 2 years before any of this was possible, had been broken by the best possible force, not by argument, not by pleading, but by a woman who had simply arrived and been so thoroughly, undeniably present that the oath had nowhere left to stand. He had sworn he would never ask another woman to stay. She had started unpacking, and he had forgotten the oath completely. And the land and the light and the people they had become together said, simply, unmistakably, that this was exactly as it should be. Some years later, when Thomas was old enough to ask about how his parents had met, Jasper told him the story straight, the stagecoach and the trunk and the post office and the dinner and the wildflowers from the east field and the sunset on the west porch. Thomas listened with the focused attention that was equal parts both of them, and then said, Did you know right away that she was the one?" Jasper looked at Dorothy across the room, who was sitting at her desk going over accounts with the ink-stained wrist and the focused expression and the small smile that was there even when she was concentrating, and Dorothy looked back at him with the green eyes that saw everything. "Not right away," Jasper said, which was honest, "but early enough." "How did you know?" Thomas pressed. Jasper thought about the post office and the sunset and the hands laced together on the way back from the Aldersons, and 2 weeks in Fort Worth thinking about her every day, and the moment he came home and found her waiting on the boarding house porch. He thought about an oath spoken into the dark, and a woman unpacking with complete certainty, and the particular, irreversible feeling of a life becoming what it was meant to be. "She was already home before I asked her," he said. "That is how I knew." Dorothy put down her pen. She looked at him across the room with everything that had accumulated between them. The years and the children and the land and the work and the sunsets and all the mornings and all the difficult things carried together and all the good things enlarged by sharing, and she smiled. Just that. Just the smile. It was enough. It had always been enough. Outside the window of the ranch house on the Texas plains, in the late afternoon of a summer in 1888, the sky was beginning its nightly transformation, reliable and extraordinary and not to be gotten used to, and the land ran out in all directions under it, particular and enduring and entirely, permanently home.